Today is, what's the date?
No,
No,
September 21.
September 21, Tuesday. And I am here again with my dear friend, Roel Bijkerk. And this is actually the beginning of part 5. You realize we've done 5 sessions together?
Actually 6, because the first one was more than 2 hours.
Oh, right.
So
Yeah.
for me that counted as
Right.
double.
We did a double one, yeah. Although I think we did a double one last time.
Well, there was one of almost an hour and a half, that's true.
And we did that, the story of your Canadian vacation. That was such a wonderful...
Oh, those 2 days in Canada.
We didn't, did we split that up? I think we did split that into 2. So, but anyway...
I don't know, I didn't look at that, but I remember that as one session, really.
Right. So if we think about this particular session as kind of a wrap-up, a condensed version of the whole thing, or your perspective on your life, what you've learned, what do you have to say? How do we start that conversation about, your experience as it is right now and what you have to say about it? Does that sound like a question to you?
It can go into 2 directions.
Okay.
What has this life come to mean for me? And the other direction would be what I have come to think about as the meaning of just life in general, not just for me, but for everything else that's alive. And that question has been preoccupying me for quite a while now. More so than the question, what does this life mean for me?
Okay, goodbye.
And you want me to talk about that?
Yes.
Oh, okay. Well, to start with the short one, what has this life come to mean for me? And then I will have to go back to the time when it was, as it were, prescribed for me already, being a member of the Christian Reformed Church in the Netherlands and here. And then why I broke with that. It was the teaching of the parents, the church, the school, and so on, that all basically told me, and I've heard this from my good Reverend Boomsma several times in the years that I was here going to church. What they told me was that, well, basically, your life for yourself doesn't mean anything. That's not important. What is important is the life to come afterwards. What your job is here is basically to, and that word was used, to worship God, period. That's what you're here for. And it's when you do that properly, then maybe you will get into heaven, and then everything will just be bliss. No further specification. It was enough to be there. And well, that's what you had in mind when somebody would ask you, what are you here for? What does it mean to live? Now, it was basically to worship God. And it's with that, and the thing that goes with it, the life here is not really important for you. That life doesn't mean anything much. It was created by God, and that's about it. But it doesn't have, and shouldn't have, much more of a big role in your life. This is not the important thing. I remember hearing that Reverend Boomsma say that a number of times in his most inspired sermons that were very good in many ways, but that was sort of the upshot of it. And that always bothered me a little bit. Is that really all there is to it? That you have to worship something? You don't have to really be so concerned about it. it's pretty bad anyway, because of, and there you have it, that fall into sin. And then there came the redemption, and now it's a little better again. But it's still not really all that much, this life, and everything that happens in it to you. And that's what I began to struggle with and then against, more and more.
What period were you struggling that in that the most?
Oh, basically when I was in my late teens.
Oh.
Because I saw too much trouble and misery around me to not think, well, what's the use of all that? And isn't there something better that I can maybe help do something about, instead of just sort of shrugging his shoulder, and like the Muslims did, and with Allah Akbar. God is great, He knows, I don't have to really think too much about it, and I cannot do anything about it anyway. I couldn't accept that already as a late teenager. So I kept asking questions.
Was there a lot of Islam influence around you at that when
Well,
you were?
we lived in a country that was 80% Islam,
Okay.
and is now more and more conservative than it was in the very liberal days when I lived there. But still, it was there. It was around me all the time. Our servants were, of course, or as we call it, Mohammedan, which is, of course, the wrong way of characterizing it, but it was very common in those days. You should not call it Mohammedan. It's not after that person, but it's Islam. Be obedient.
Right. Submit.
And submit and worship, yeah. So that was there all the time. And when I, during the occupation, had a little business in moving people from one house to the other when they were kicked out again, I had to employ some of the adult men who were sort of waiting around at the marketplace for somebody to hire them for a day and have them make some money so they could live for a week or two. Then I found out that that was really something by which they lived in many ways. That also would take away some worries for them. There would always be family that they could go to, and they would take care of them for a while, just as they would take care of family members if they had something, and those family members would come for some help. It was always this Allah Akbar. God will provide, and He knows, and that's enough. I just have to submit and be obedient. And praise. That was, of course, also important. So I grew up with that all around me all the time. And that impressed me, because they could really live by that. The Westerners around me often might say it when they had to, as in school, or at home, or in the church, but it didn't look too often like they really did live by it. And that also intrigued me, that there was so often a split between their supposed basic beliefs and what they really portrayed in real life. So that started fairly young, yeah. And then, well, you start going to school again in the Netherlands and learning also on your own about a lot of scientific ideas that have come around in the last few centuries, and you start asking more questions. And that's what I did. And eventually I began to really question, but that's a good deal later, after I have gone to America and started teaching at this very reformed college. Then you begin to question things like, what about that nature of Jesus? The divine nature. You cannot question that, but I did begin to question that. And the more I got to know about it, the more I began to doubt that was just a good idea, and eventually dropped it. And the same thing with the authority of the Bible, the authority of Scripture. If you get to know a little bit more about how that came about and how it became the rule of the church, you find out that all of that came about hundreds of years after Jesus was dead, the early 4th century, that finally began to grow into the dogma of all the Christians. And it was decided by voice vote, I imagine, at that concilium there in what is now Turkey. And I thought, is that the way to decide what is really God's word? A bunch of old men getting together and then voting first to throw a bunch of them, their own colleagues out because they didn't want to have to seriously go into what they might think and bring up as questions. And then decide, well, this book in, that book out, this book in, oh, maybe part way, like with Esther and so on. I thought that's not the way to establish forever something that is absolute. And I began to question all absolute answers. And I've come finally to the point of view that there is no such thing, that you have to be very suspicious of any answer about anything, science or philosophy or whatever, that has the presumption of being a final answer.
Right. How did your scholarship, your understanding of Jung help you in this? Did it help
Well,
you?
he asked some of the same questions,
Okay.
and he did not just throw out religion. On the contrary, that was for him the most important thing from the very start. All his scientific work, if you want to use that term, was in the service of getting to know more and understand more about religious experience and knowledge and history. He was very serious about that and always respected the importance of religion, and often said the only thing that can replace a religion is another religion. You cannot replace it with science. You cannot replace it with just something you feel. It has to be a worked out set of ideas too. And it has to take serious that notion of another transcendent reality that we may or may not be in touch with. So that was very different from people like Freud, who basically didn't like religion. He wanted adjustment and adaptation to this world and this life, because that was for him the problem, not for Jung. And it was the attitude of many other people, especially in science, to just reject the whole thing. If you can really believe this, then you can believe anything. And you cannot be serious about religion at all anymore. That was not Jung. So I very much profited from finding out more about the way in which somebody like Jung started to try and look at questions of religion in a serious way, not just either or, believing or not believing. That's kind of important, because today there's going to be the same problem still for very many people. They cannot just let go of religion. Religion is part of being human, you might say, but they can also no longer believe in the many different kinds of dogma and prescription that the different major religions have ready for everybody. So what are they going to do? That's why they are looking for alternative forms of spirituality, is then the word that comes in. They don't like the word religion anymore.
Right. So how did that work out for you? Your questioning continued, and now you're at Calvin, and you're kind of surrounded with this dogma.
Yeah, and then came some very practical issues in particularly counseling, where I would have to, with what I really was beginning to think, I would have to go with that when talking to students and with problems and questions. And I couldn't just give any more the same answers that they would get and had gotten before from the officials of the church and their parents and the school. And that would be a real conflict between my counseling and the expectations that the school, rightly so, had of what I would do in my job as a counselor. And particularly, of course, also in the question of human sexuality, where I had come to very different ideas because of what I got to know and had personally experienced around me in the Netherlands already before. And the Netherlands was going really much more, even after that, in the more liberal direction. And I knew about that. So that was a reason for me to decide. And for Ini too, who went along with what we both were already doing then with me, also, that we just couldn't honestly stay. It would have to become either living a lie by saying things we didn't really believe in, or just shutting up and not saying anything at all about many things, because we didn't want to create a problem for the church and the school by being there, and that's why we left. Now, the alternativist, we didn't really get to talk much about, and that's really what I would like to say a little bit more about, because it's not enough to just drop things.
Right, you just said that, yeah.
You have to come up with something in place of it that can satisfy the basic desire, the basic need, I would say, of some all-encompassing point of view of this life and, if you will, the next life, if there is something like that. And that's where Jung certainly became very helpful. And William James, I have to say, in one of the last years that I was at Calvin, I started studying William James more. And I was particularly struck by his problem at the end of his life that he expressed in a letter to a good friend. This was maybe the last year or in the last 2 years of his life. Yeah, it was about then. That he wrote in a letter, and I think this is a good anecdote to start with then. He said, something like this, I'm persuaded that we are nature, through and through, and that not the slightest wiggle of our will happens without some physical laws directing it. So I'm entirely persuaded that we are nature, through and through. We are a product of this world. And yet, and there comes the problem, and yet we somehow are en rapport, as he put it, with the spirit, capital S. And then he sort of throws up his hand and says, who can conceive it? Who can understand it? Who can really know it? In other words, I don't. And yet, he says, and that's the final part of the sentence, and yet, someday we will see. Damn it, we will see. That's how he ends that
He
letter.
ends it with, damn it. We'll
Oh,
see.
yeah, yeah. Well, maybe he was just an outspoken Republican, I don't know. Because that's, in those days, something that you heard a lot about Republicans like Goldwater. They wouldn't hesitate to say, damn it this and damn it that.
Right.
But James wrote that maybe in 1908 or 1909, but maybe he was a Republican too, who was already outspoken then.
Right.
And the other thing that I liked about William James, and this is the tie-in with Jung, is that he already somewhere else wrote much earlier, when he talked about consciousness, that our human consciousness is only separated in the individual by a very thin, filmy screen from a much larger consciousness that is all around us, and any particular event that happened may at a given moment tear that screen, and something will come through, and we become part, for a moment at least, of some consciousness that is a lot bigger than our individual one. Now, this is really an anticipation of Jung's idea of consciousness for us existing really in two worlds: the world of our own individual experience and being, but that much, much larger collective world of what he came to call eventually collective unconscious and consciousness. And William James already sensed that. And that struck me so. I remember those two things. And helped me make the decision too that it's in that direction that I will have to start searching more. Especially that notion of we are a product of this nature here. We were not dropped here from outside by some transcendental power. No, somehow that is there, perhaps, but then it came into the natural world. And that's where, for instance, and that's what I got again from Jung, the notion of the virgin birth comes in. Does that surprise you?
Well, tell me the context. How does that?
Well,
so our consciousness is
the
born.
virgin birth, of course, became a dogma.
Right.
That particularly in the Roman Catholic Church became very, very important. That there is this miracle happening, that there is this earthly woman who's still a virgin, and yet somehow she becomes pregnant, but not because of a man, not because of nature, but because of something from outside, transcendental, coming in, and the product of that is now this human being with a double nature, namely also being God. That's how that was entered into the dogmas of the church and of all Christianity for quite a while. And is that real? Do you have to really start accepting that as the truth, that particular event really happened the way it is described? And there you get the problem of literalism versus metaphoric appreciation of an attempt to express something that cannot be expressed otherwise than in a symbolic form. And if you look at that story symbolically as a metaphor, you can understand it and appreciate it in a very different way than as a literal thing that actually happened and was recorded in a literal, material way. And then you find out, if you study more anthropology and so on, that this whole idea is much older than the Christian notion. It was much older than Jesus' birth itself, that there are other cultures that have a story sort of like that, where something breaks into this natural world and creates something really new, different. And that is going to be important. That may be becoming exceedingly helpful. That reminds me, by the way, of another little anecdote. For my grandson, I found a little story, and he liked bedtime stories. A little story of an Indian tribe from long before any Westerner with Christian ideas set foot in this continent. It's called Arrow to the Sun. And it starts like this. There is this maiden in a teepee, which has typically a little open hole in the top of the teepee, and she's resting and she's asleep, and then the sun sends a ray down to earth, going right through that opening in the teepee, and it lands on this sleeping young maiden. And then she becomes pregnant. And she gives birth to a son who is going to be the hero of the story, who has to grow up without a real husband as the father, but just with the mother, and is teased for that, and then decides he should find contact with his father. And then he goes through adventure this and adventure that. Finally, he is back with his father, and then his father tells him, well, you have to go back and you have to perform these great deeds. They are a sort of test of whether you really are my son and can do something useful there. So he goes back and he goes through 3 very important big trials as a hero, and then he succeeds, and the father lets him really come back and accepts him, and then he can do much good for his people, and that's the good end of the story. And that's when my grandson would always then sort of turn around with a deep sigh and mercifully go to sleep when I read it to him, and that was his favorite story. Now, these kinds of stories had been around long before Christianity was even begun. And that got me to appreciate much more attempts of people like Jung to not just reject the whole thing as a fantasy nonsense, but to try to understand what were the people who invented that story in different parts of the world at different times as compared with each other, and without contact with each other in any way, so they didn't learn it from each other, but somehow spontaneously they came up with stories like this in different cultures, different times. To understand that in another positive way, rather than just throw it out from their culture, and to give it a symbolic interpretation. This is the deep sense in the human being that when it comes to human consciousness and living in this world, besides being a product of nature, there's also something else that is really different and really new than what otherwise would simply be the all-out meaning of nature in this world. And if you then ask me, well, what would that be then without stories like that? Well, what can the nature of life then be? I would say it's very simple. Life as it is for everything else besides the human consciousness is really basically very simple and easy to see and understand. All it is eat and be eaten, nothing else. Anything that lives has to obey that one law of nature. You eat by eating other things that have been alive shortly before, but you eat that and you propagate, you adapt in order to eat and propagate, and then at a given moment that's over for you, and so you get eaten. What else is there? What is the life of even the greatest predators on Earth, after they are done, they die and they get eaten. So eaten be eaten is the universal law. And we human creatures have been living by that too, in the different species types that we have developed over time. And if that's all there is to it, it's simple. You don't really have to think much about that. If that's all that consciousness is for, and there's no doubt that it is for that too. Animals have consciousness. We never quite know when that started, and maybe it was there from the very beginning, maybe a little later, but there's no doubt that many animals have consciousness, right? You can knock a dog unconscious. Well, if you can knock him unconscious, he must have consciousness. You can knock something unconscious that doesn't have consciousness. And so it is with all the other animals that we are familiar with, although it's kind of difficult sometimes to say, here it begins and there it ends. Is a chicken conscious? Well, it looks like it in many ways. Not like a dog, and not like an ape, of course. Is a worm conscious? I don't know. But is there no consciousness in a worm? I don't know either. And it doesn't really matter, does it? If that's all there is to it, that consciousness serves the purpose of adaptation, and that means the purpose of eat and be eaten eventually. So what is different about human consciousness? And that's where the other question comes in. Did that begin somewhere? And is it already that other kind of consciousness? Is it already there in other species of human beings? And that reminds me of another anecdote, this time of Jung. And I really want to talk about that a minute. Okay. Are you familiar with the story that Jung was, as it were, struck by lightning at a given moment about the question of the role of human consciousness when he was on one of his travels in Africa? No. You know, I think it's a very important, it was for Jung a very important moment, as he later describes it in his autobiographical notes. He went to Africa when he was in his early 50s, in the late 1920s. I think it was 27, 28 or thereabouts, 1927 or 28. He went to Africa to check up on something that he thought he had discovered.
Where in Africa?
In his patients.
You know, where he went?
To primitive Africa, because he wanted to check with really primitive tribes, and particularly their medicine men or witch doctors, how do they look at some things that I think, discovered. And what he had discovered was the world of the collective unconscious and the different kind of contents there as compared with regular human consciousness. The world of the archetypes, the world of forces that are much stronger than us and are alive and are present also in us or through us, and that sometimes we can get in touch with, often without wanting it, but there it is. They can take over. And it is important to get to know about them. That's what he wanted to check, especially when it comes to dreams. If in primitive cultures, where it might still be around too from the very beginning of humanness, in primitive tribes, and Africa was the closest by, it was really still very primitive conditions in those days. This was before the safaris were discovered and became popular to so-called primitive Africa, as they have become by now. That didn't really start until the 1930s, 1940s. So there were still very old, ancient, primitive cultures around in Africa, even in tribes that had some remote contact or superficial contact with Western people. So he decided, I'll go there, as he later decided to talk with Native American people, and particularly their medicine men, to find out how do they deal with dreams. Do they make the same distinction I make about usual, trivial contents in most dreams that most people have here in the West? But occasionally a dream sees a breaking through of something from a deeper level, which is much more powerful, much more important, and much more important to pay attention to. And he found out that in Native American tribes that was so, that it was true in India, and he wanted to check in Africa for himself to find out if that was true there also. So he went to Africa in an expedition and managed to find some truly primitive tribes and to communicate through an interpreter from the area with the medicine men of the tribe. And he found that they indeed made, and always had made, the same difference in the use of dreams that he had come to make between archetypal dreams and the normal, usually unimportant daily dreams that everybody still has today, even in very cultured places like Western Europe. And that, of course, satisfied him already a great deal and made him even more aware of the importance of trying to understand human consciousness more. And even if we have to assume that previous species of humans, like the Neanderthaler and so on, didn't have that sense, well, when then and where then in human consciousness did that new thing come up? On his way back with that expedition to Egypt, where they would take the boat and go to Western Europe again, they came by the great plains of the Serengeti. You know about that? On East Africa. Every year there is the great trek of the wild animals through the Serengeti plains to other areas because of the season of the year. And then there are these hundreds of thousands of different kinds of animals, from birds to cattle to, of course, also predators, all trekking in the same direction. And now that has become a popular safari object for tourists, because then they can see that that still really happens even today. And well, they camped in that expedition that you had on their way to the north. They camped very close to the Serengeti Plains. And one late afternoon, when they were setting up camp, Jung wanted to be by himself and think a bit about things that he was interested in and that he had just experienced in the conversations with tribesmen and their medicine men. So he gets away from the people working on that campsite and goes up a hill and goes to the top of the hill, and that's right next to the side of the Serengeti Plains. So he sits down there and looks out and sees all those hundreds of thousands of animals coming by, all going in the same direction. Having done that for at least hundreds and maybe thousands of years, the same way every time again. And he sits there and he looks at that, and then it strikes him, the lightning, as it were, from the air. And all those times, as it were, there was nobody to see it, to notice it, let alone to wonder, what is this? What's going on here? What are they doing? What's this for? What's the sense of all this? A question that has nothing to do anymore at that moment with mere survival and adaptation and eat and be eaten. Right now it's another kind of consciousness that awakens when somebody asks that question. And so it strikes him, there must have been somebody at some time, a human being, probably the latest type like we, who began to ask that question. That's a new kind of consciousness. That's what struck him with lightning, as it were. And this is where the answer lies to the question, why do they come up with those symbolic answers to what is obviously there and cannot be explained in terms of mere nature? Here is the link in this kind of reflective consciousness that is more than merely functional consciousness in the aid of survival and the general law of nature. But this is a different kind of consciousness, a consciousness that has the ability to reflect on its own consciousness too. And that kind of consciousness is my goal to now investigate Jung's thought. And well, when I read that, something hit me.
Right, that's what I was
When I
thinking.
read
Lightning hit you too,
Yeah.
right?
And that was lucky, because I have found that not everybody who reads that has the same sort of lightning strike him or her. I've met people who read that, and I remember one who said, well, yeah, I read that, and I read that he thought it was so important to him at that moment. And so I read it again and again, and I just don't get it. I mean, so here he sees all these animals going by, and that opens a world for him that's new. I don't get it. I just don't see it. I doubt that if I would see that for the first time, I would be impressed. But the same way that I can be impressed when I see a gorilla go like this. It's big, it's powerful, but do I get a kind of a sudden inspiration from it? No. So not everybody has that reaction, but Jung did have that reaction at that moment when it suddenly struck him. Somebody, human, has found that to be something new to wonder about. And look at what has come out of that experience at that time for that person. That's when reflected consciousness began to look at nature in a different way and got a new perspective and began to inquire into it in a new way and find out more and more about it that was not known to anything that had lived before.
Right.
And look what has come of that.
Do you think that this idea in quantum physics and quantum consciousness, the effect the observer has on the phenomena, is connected to that at all?
Frankly, I don't think so.
Okay.
But you can make that connection. You can use, if you will, I guess, the finding in quantum mechanics that the observer is part of the thing and helps, as it were, in his observing to make things happen. He's not neutral, he's not out there.
Right, but what Jung is discovering, you think is a little different.
That's a little different. Also, by the way, that paves the way for another question. And are we the latest, not only the latest, it seems like that, but are we also the last one in the whole series of species of animal this and animal that, primitive humanoid, then primitive human, less primitive, and then us? Are we the last one on that scale? Probably not. And that brings up the question, well, could it well be that before long we will be replaced, just like we replaced the Neanderthaler? Although not completely, because apparently they mixed it up too, because right now every human being alive today has some Neanderthaler DNA spooking around in him too. And then probably also of prior species. So do we really think we're the last one? Or will we be someday, and who knows when, be a little piece of DNA in whatever the other creature may be? And just as the Neanderthaler could not have any fantasy about what we would be like, we will not be able, at least for a while, to have an idea of what the next creature will be. There are already speculations going on, for instance, by the hybrid that is going to be coming before long of the present human being with the computer.
AI, right? Artificial intelligence.
The AI human type, and we have really no conception of what that might be like, any more than the Neanderthaler had us in mind, possibly, as that's the next creature going to be. So let's not worry about that. I would say, how long have we been around? 45, 50,000 years? That's not very long. Even Neanderthaler has been around at least 150 to 200,000 years. And that was not very long compared with what was around before that, the Homo erectus, for, probably 1.5 million years. And then a couple million years before that, there were those human-like critters that were walking around on two legs, and apparently had a family kind of life, but had a brain not half ours. That reminds me of another anecdote that is kind of relevant here. There was an exposition in the Netherlands about the development of the human species out of all the previous ones, from the big apes to the Australopithecus, and that's that earliest form from maybe 3.5, 4.5 million years ago. And then the next steps, the Erectus, the Habilis, the Neanderthal, and then us, Cro-Magnon. And I took pictures of that exhibition. And they had them in, as it were, their own environments set up on stages in that exhibition. It was a very interesting exhibition. And I had pictures of that, slides, and I showed that in classes, in some courses.
At Calvin?
No, not at Calvin.
Okay.
This was at Grand Valley.
Okay.
And that must have been in the late 1980s, because that's when I went to the Netherlands every year and went to that exhibition too sometime. And so I showed them, this is a theory about consciousness. And then it finally comes to Jung with another kind of reflective consciousness finally evolving out of those. I got a letter from a student, and there were some students who just told me later, afterwards, a letter from a student who had been in that class and said, Professor Bijker, I'm offended that you had us sit through that class looking and watching those creatures as if we were related to them in some way over time. I find that offensive, because I know that I was created special by my Creator. And that student took exception to the fact that I was asking them to even look at that and imagine that there was a kinship of some sort between that in the far past, which that first student didn't believe in either, was a creationist, and the present. Now this was in the 1980s. And this was not at Cleveland College.
No.
This was a student at Grand Valley, working his way, her way, through whatever the requirements were, but not finding any kind of relationship or kinship with those earlier species, or with any animal for that matter.
Right.
We are a product of a special creation, and we don't belong here, really. We belong back to God.
Right, but it's even in our Declaration of Independence. All men are created equal. We don't say all men evolved.
Yeah,
Right? It's
but
right there.
it didn't say created by what kind of creator. It was careful not to do that.
By their
Jefferson was one of those who was too careful in his words to sort of accept the possible suspicion that they meant by the God that we now accept as our creator.
Right.
So they left it with by our creator.
By their creator.
Whatever that creator may have been
Right.
can be the interpretation.
That-
And you know that Jefferson rejected the whole Old Testament and most of the New Testament
Right.
miracles and so on.
Yeah.
Have you ever seen the little Jefferson Bible? There's not much over from
Right.
the whole thing, is there?
Right. Right.
And he's then one of our great founding fathers.
Yes.
Yes.
But I still,
But still, a lot of people say, well, he shouldn't have been.
you know, where we started with Jung and his deep respect for this evolution of religion, I think is a really good position than throwing it out.
That's right.
You know, and so in terms of your own story and your own, because I was thinking about Joseph Campbell talks about the aha moment, you know.
Yeah.
So that was aha moment for Jung and for you.
Oh, yeah.
Probably me too. Where do you go from there in your own experience?
Well, then comes the larger question.
Right.
Okay, so what is that for? What good did it do to develop that reflective consciousness? Does that have a goal? And I've begun to think, yes, for what it's worth. And this is not a final answer. This is what I think of as the final answer at the moment is not final, but it's a good answer, and it's a good answer because it opens up more and better questions. I think that's the best we can do with our questions and our answers. That is to come up with an answer that opens up more and good questions, and keep going for who knows how long and in what direction. We don't know. But okay, so why did that reflective consciousness develop out of the functional consciousness? Well, look at what it has done so far. It has created more and more consciousness of consciousness. It has created also through technology more and more knowledge, not only of this human set of affairs down here, but of the cosmos in general. You might even make a joke of it and say, having come out of nature, nature apparently has developed something that begins to know nature itself. So we, as the creatures who seem to be the only ones so far who do that, we are a product of nature with the purpose of nature coming to self-consciousness and awareness and self-knowledge. Well, that sounds a little weird, doesn't it? And it is. But you might sort of make a joke of it and say, well, that's what we are. That's the purpose of the human consciousness. It's for the larger nature of which that human consciousness is part to become conscious of itself. It's a weird kind of way of putting it, and I wouldn't take it literally. That's not my answer. But the answer is the development of an awareness of nature itself and even the cosmos beyond this nature here, of which we are a product. We become a cosmic kind of consciousness, and that is developing, and who knows where that may lead. And we are perhaps one stage among many more to come where that process goes on. And whether it will come to a finish ever, who knows? Frankly, I don't care. But right now it makes sense to me that we are having the duty, as it were, to increase our consciousness, not only of ourselves, our own physical being, and the physical nature and world around us, but also of the cosmos at large, and explore that. Keep exploring farther and farther out. And now we have reached the point where already one of the things that has been produced by nature here on Earth through us has left our sun and its planets around it. Our solar system has been left already by 2 spacecraft. What are they called again? Pioneer 1 and 2?
Okay.
Something like that,
Right.
I believe. I'm not sure. And they're so far now, and who knows what that may lead to. We might get in touch with some critter who picks that up somewhere out there in far space.
Right. I know that, I think it might have been one of Stephen Rao's books, the philosopher at Grand Valley, Stephen Rao.
Yes, I know.
Talking about the most significant part of the space program for human beings was looking back and seeing the Earth as this big blue marble. How that image had never been seen before by human beings, and seeing the Earth floating in space like that had an effect on our consciousness.
Has it? So
well, that's the premise that he said. We've never seen that image, and it kind of goes with
in a way we have,
right. But what I wanted to ask
not physically.
What I wanted to ask you was what you were just talking about. Have you come across any practices or techniques to assist in this movement or this reflective process of consciousness? Have you looked for techniques? Like, Jung would say, well, look at your dreams, maybe write them down. A lot of people have.
Well, but especially active imagination,
Okay.
which is what he's discovered,
Describe
or was forced to discover.
What does that mean?
Well, it's what you would perhaps best call having visions, in which there is an exchange with what's in the vision. It is active imagination. That is, you can get into a dialogue with what appears in those visions. That's not dreaming. In a dream, usually at least, you are not in a dialogue with the critters in your dream.
You're just watching, yeah.
You are just given a picture, as it were. Sometimes it's even in the form of, you see a screen with images on it in the dream. But that's not active imagination. That's why Jung called it active, because you can get into conversation. You can have a back and forth. You can ask questions. You can even disagree, as he did when he stumbled onto that practice, which became a practice, a technique of active imagination. And that's when he had the experiences that have been finally recorded in that famous Red Book, which you can now buy at Barnes & Noble if you want to, and that gives you the English translation of the things that he experienced in a series of visionary encounters over a period of 3 or 4 years and later, but he didn't describe all of those. But in the Red Book is his initial experience described and recorded. and where you can see that for him it was not a dream, and he could make himself go into that. That's, by the way, the difference between what Jung did in active imagination at that time and what happens to, for instance, the schizophrenic or the psychotic in general, who has no control over when it comes over him,
Right.
and cannot make it go away any moment he wants to.
So is it like a meditation then that he would go into?
Well,
A special place, a ritual?
well, it was a ritual, yes. And it was a practice, an imaginary practice that he got himself into. And that became his routine in his life for a couple of years. He would have his regular life with his family. Husband, father of 4 children then already, 4 or 5. And he had his practice as a physician, psychiatrist. He had patients come. He would go on vacation. He would sometimes give lectures. Amongst that was one travel to England where he gave a series of very important lectures to physicians. This was for the British Association of Physicians. So he had his regular professional and personal life. But then, usually in the evening, after dinner, he would say, well, good night, you all, and he would go to his study. Door closed, and they knew no interruptions of any sort. And he would sit in his chair behind his desk, and he would start imagining things. And at first, that was without any particular result. But he would imagine that he was digging a hole down into the earth. And he made it as real an imaginary experience as possible. And as he did that, time after time, without any results at first, but eventually it began to become more real. And it began to take on a life of its own. And then finally begin to real visions. He begins to meet people, characters. I say characters because they were not people from today, but people that he had known, as it were, from reading, like a monk in the desert in Egypt, from the time that Christianity just began with the seeking isolation and going into monkish ways of living and so on. And then he began to have whole adventures. And those are recorded in that red book, Visionary Experiences, which promptly, of course, later, when psychiatrists and psychologists read that he had done that, said, well, see, that's psychosis. He just went into a psychotic disturbance. He was rare in that he got out of it. He got through it, and it became a creative psychosis.
Was it called Visionary Experiences? Is that the title?
No, they said, well, that's just what you find in any
title?
mental institutions.
What's the
For
title?
him, that was the product of what he came to call active imagination.
Was that the title of the book?
Red book.
Oh, just Red Book.
You see, well, that came in stages. What he did was, when he was told to do that in one of those earliest visions, write this down, record this, make this last. So he started doing that.
Okay.
Every time he had, for a couple hours in the evening, an experience like that, he would write it down. And he wrote 7 large volumes in his own handwriting. You can buy those now.
Oh.
They will cost you a couple $100, but they have made facsimiles of those, so you get the real picture of what he wrote down in those books, and the translation
Oh, yes.
of it in regular, and a commentary.
Do you have those?
No, I'm thinking of it.
Okay,
But I have the red book
right,
in its facsimile of the original, big book.
right.
If you're interested, I'll show it to you, because there's beautiful artwork in it too. He didn't see it as artwork, but okay, it is like a book from the Middle Ages,
Right.
when the monks sat down
Right, right.
and laboriously made pictures in the book, sometimes big ones, and often smaller ones at the beginning of a page, for instance.
But the critics thought that this was not
It
good.
was just psychosis. I've
Yeah.
been told that, and I've read that so often. That I would give you 9 out of 10. Psychologists and psychiatrists now, the standard ones, the mainstream ones, would say, he obviously had a psychosis breakdown.
Right.
That's why it's called a psychotic breakdown.
Right,
But he was lucky, he got out of it.
right. So how does this connect? Can we connect this to your experience of questioning, and did you adopt any of these techniques or practices for
No.
yourself?
I tried,
Okay.
and I couldn't do it. I was just too distracted by all kinds of real things around me. And I always wished I had been able to get into active imagination myself. I've known people who
How about
managed to
Enid?
do that.
How about Enid? Was she?
Any, well, not by that kind of active imagination, but that kind of thing has been developed by other people besides Jung, except they didn't call it active imagination,
Right.
but they would call it something else, like free imagery. A guy at Michigan State University developed that with some students and used that too. Or they would call it something else. There was a Belgian who gave it still another name. And the latest form of that, you may have heard of it or actually done it, is standing growth. The Czechoslovakian who came to this country and at first started working with LSD, because you can sort of guide that too.
Right.
When the person gets into an LSD state, then the therapist can help guide that a little bit. And that person can have all kinds of adventures in his imagination, who is in that LSD state. But then LSD was forbidden here in this country. Nobody could do it at all anymore.
Right.
And so Grove, over years, developed another technique, which he calls holotropic breathing. Holotropic, that is tending toward becoming whole again. That is getting in touch with that possibility which is there in everybody. We see it in its negative, sick form in psychosis.
Right.
But we can also experience it positively in something like active imagination, or here in holotropic breathing. Ini has done that.
Right.
She has gone through that. It was very worthwhile. She learned an awful lot also for her therapy by doing that herself. And then later she learned how to do that with other people.
Right.
I couldn't get to that point. I've never been able to figure out why not, because I know it's a possibility that we have.
I wonder if it's sort of like a shaman. Some
Yes.
people who are good at it,
Yes,
and you read what they have to say about it, and you learn, but you say, it's not my talent. I can't do that.
no, but I know from my own experience that it is possible in principle for me too.
Okay.
Because I have had little, not controlled, not in my power, but I have had little spontaneous vision-like experiences. And some of them very important to me in my personal life, because they showed me something that I had not figured out before, and that was important. In dreams, certainly. In some of my dreams, I got a very clear kind of indicator about decisions to make, important decisions like getting married or migrating to the United States, that first time accepting the invitation and so on. And people say, oh, not really. I mean, dreams is interesting stuff, but you don't base any real decision on a dream you've had, do you? And I said, yes, yeah, I did. And certainly somebody like Jung did that a number of times. So, no, I know it's possible. I know I have the potential for it, but I apparently did not have the proper discipline. And for some people it's easier than for others.
I had a dream that I think of as an archetypal dream. And it was, in the dream, I was wearing two shoes. One fit and one was too small. And I was trying to hide the fact that one was too small. And
now, when did you have that dream? Was that before just before you broke with some of your past connection to the church?
no, it wasn't anything to do with the church. It had to do with my vocation and my avocation.
Oh,
Because I explained the dream to somebody, these shoes that don't fit. And he said, oh, that reminds me of something Gurdjieff said.
oh,
The Russian mystic,
yeah,
right?
I know about Gurdjieff.
Make your living with your left foot. And that was like, oh, make your living with what your art is.
Yeah, yeah.
And that was, for me, it was like, okay, I'm going to do this.
Okay, but it had to do with an important decision.
Yes.
I mean, it was sort of an eye-opener to you. Hey, there's a good part in your life that doesn't really fit you.
Right. And
And you're trying to hide that,
try to hide it.
but it won't work. Because you can really
That
keep
interesting?
walking very well.
Yeah.
Yeah.
It was interesting. Yeah, and actually there's a person in the dream who points it out. Hey, that does not fit.
Oh, okay.
And I go, oh, no, it's fine. And I run away.
That's one of the common figures in many dreams.
Yeah.
Somebody who points out something to
Right.
you. Often it was an old, wise person,
Yes.
either a man or a woman.
Right.
Yeah.
The other thing that you were talking about with Jung and the hole digging is a Rumi poem, and that goes, this is Rumi, this talk is like stamping coins, while the real work is being done by someone digging in the ground.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, the real work. But that's always been a psychological motif, is an image of somebody digging, right? They're digging.
Yeah.
But so that's your own reflections now, and we were...
If I may finish this
Yes,
then for a
I'm
moment.
sorry, yes.
And this brings me to the point. Okay, so if this is the future, we have to develop more knowledge, not only of the cosmos outside there, but also of the cosmos inside. How do we do that? And where do we go for that? And then it occurs to me that this is where the world has split two sets of cultures for a long time already. Don't ask me why, but somehow it did happen that way, that in the West, certain cultures, we went into the world outside of us. And we have made lots of ground there. We have gone a long ways, even to the point of entering already the space outside our own little part of the cosmos, our solar system. And it will go on more than before. And we have made some important discoveries also about ourselves. For instance, this is a little bit like this consciousness upon yourself. What's the Milky Way? What has it been for the human being for a very long time? Well, it's a bunch of stars out there, all with their own planets around them and so on, right? But it's out there. That's the Milky Way. You can see it. When you go outside during the evening and it's clear, there's the Milky Way. We are here, there's the Milky Way. No, it isn't. Then comes the discovery at a given moment, oh, you know what? It's all the way, we are part of it.
Mm.
We are part of the Milky Way. We are the Milky Way looking at itself. Well, you have that strange way of putting things in a suddenly different perspective. And that makes a change in our consciousness. When we suddenly realize that's not the world out there with maybe God somewhere. No, we are part of that thing. We are the world. But the East turned part of the world. The cultures in India, China, Japan, they have gone another way. They have gone inside. And that's why now we are beginning to see both of them wanting to know more about what the other side of the world has accomplished so far.
Right.
And so we see technology and Western science becoming suddenly very, very important to the East.
Mm-hmm.
And here we see more and more interest and asking questions coming about of what the East has discovered, even to the point of now regular conferences between brain scientists and neurospecialists, having conferences with the Dalai Lama and other meditators for years, and finding out, hey, they've got something too. So
Beautiful.
there it begins to grow,
Right.
this consciousness. And we have a lot to learn yet about that inner world of ours, and a good help in that direction is now beginning to come to us from the East,
Yeah, that's
which
where.
I find helpful.
Me too. I think Robert Johnson was a very important teacher. He spent 10 years living in India, right, Johnson?
Well, many, many times
Yeah.
for quite a while, yes.
Yes, and he talked about that exact point, what you just made, and I was very,
Jung already did too.
yes.
That's why he studied Buddhism in such depth
Uh-huh.
in many ways.
Yeah.
And then got 2 honorary doctorships
Right.
in India because they responded to that.
Yeah. So
And
yeah,
to
so
his synthesis. He tried to synthesize it, to pull it together,
right.
and to show that there is really one larger whole that they both fit into.
Right.
And it's that whole that is important.
Yeah. So it's probably helped inform you on
Oh, yeah.
how you're going to live in this life, right? And
Absolutely.
reflecting.
Yeah.
And also, I would say, because I hear myself in this, I tell people, I'm an evolving human being. It's not done for me yet. I'm still contemplating. I'm still looking.
Oh, yeah, I don't have the final answer, that's for
Right,
sure.
right.
I don't want a final answer.
Oh, right.
And for me, this has become the replacement, as it were, the sense of being part, and really experiencing that, of being part of a much larger something going on that has to do with learning, exploring, finding out. And that's going on, whether I like it or not, whether I want it or not, whether I believe it or not, it is going on.
Mm-hmm.
And we see that now around us.
Right.
And we better become a little bit more conscious of it. And so that replaces for me the belief, and it is only a belief, apparently, because there's no proof of it one way or the other, of the Reverend Boomsma when he preaches, this is not our home, we belong somewhere else, and that will come after we are dead. I don't know what comes after we are dead,
Right.
if anything. Doesn't have to be. I would always go as far as Campbell went when he said, if you don't get it in this life, you're never going to get it, man.
Yeah.
And I think he was right. This is the life we got now. And we have to try to make the most of it as it is now. And the most is learning. exploring,
Yeah.
getting to know, experiencing. It's not acquiring property or money or power or pleasure or what. That's all to the good. Fine, get some if you can, but don't make that the thing that makes your life counts for you a little bit. Make it something more than that. So if you now ask me, what's the meaning of life? I would say, whether for me or for humanity in general, love and learn. And now I'm suddenly aping Freud, because he was asked, what's the secret of a good life? And he said, Leben und Arbeiten, love
And work.
and work.
Yes.
Well, for me, trying to learn is the work I want to do.
Yeah.
And I have found myself a lot happier and more at rest with that kind of perspective, which I call, well, if you don't like the word religious here, because you associate that too much with church, okay, call it spiritual if that's what you prefer. That for me is this spiritual life that I'm on this earth to live. Love, because you're part of it. That we now should realize very clearly. We are not an isolated brain living in a locked up skull. All that goes away. We are part of everything. That's already very clear now. You don't have to be a philosopher to recognize that. We are made of the same particles as the rest of this whole universe. Well, you have to go a little below the atom. Remember, we thought that atoms were individuals, isolated and separate from every other atom. Oh no, the atom is not individual at all. It can be split, and then you discover a whole world there, which, by the way, is constantly in exchange with all the other little worlds that are around. Have you tried mescaline? Yeah. I've read the description that Aldous Huxley gives of that. That you can then, for instance, look at your skin and you see your skin is not something that separates your inner from the outer world. The skin is sort of a way back and forth between both the outer and the inner. It allows you right through. There's constantly things going on between the two. You're exchanging particles with the outside world all the time.
Right.
So if you then stand out a little bit, all the particles that do stay around for a very long time, of everybody in the world that ever lived, is now around all over and also in you. So you share particles with Genghis Khan and with Jesus and even with Donald Trump. What a thought. There's still particles that were part of their temporary being, and they are now part of you too.
Yeah.
That already shows you that we're not individual. We are part of the whole thing. And then suddenly when you get to DNA, you see how much of the whole thing that you are, you have in common with other things that are something supposedly entirely different on their own. That's what shocked that student who sent me a letter protesting that there was a kinship between that student and those primitive creatures. How much do your DNA have in common with a chimpanzee? I don't know. Oh, about 97% or a little bit more, if it's not 98. With a chimpanzee? Said yes. Check it. Don't believe me. Check it out for yourself. Oh. So we are part of this whole business. And so we better learn to recognize in the other persons like us that they are not separate, that we are akin to them too. And we better learn the different forms of connection, relationship that are there for us to explore. From the simplest form of lust, if you will, like you can say, I like ice cream, I like sex, I like this person, sort of at the same level. And that goes on between human beings, plenty, to I love that particular individual, or I love this as a child, as a husband, as a wife, and finally, I love human beings. Agape, as the Greeks called it. And that's a whole list of things to learn for any particular human being who can be particular for a little while in a few things. And actually, that's what Jung meant when he talked about individuation. He didn't mean it in the sense of an individual who is separate and independent.
Ego, right.
Ego. He didn't mean it like that. He goes back to the original sense of the word. That is not divided. That is, or in other words, whole. That's what holotropic is really the meaning, that you try to accomplish a sense of being whole, that there are not all kinds of pieces of yourself floating around, not really fitting, but that you are one whole. That is what health basically also means. It's the same word, holo, that is in the word health, and so on. So that is what Jung means by individuation. That is working on recognizing, finding, experiencing, completing the kinship with all that lives, and in that sense becoming whole. Does that make any sense?
Yes, it does.
Yeah, and that is very different, by the way, from what a lot of the youth movements of the 60s and 70s and 80s was about, when the slogan became, do what you will, or do your own thing. Remember that one? Or we are like ships passing in the night, and that's it. Or like I have several of my students say, don't hold me today to what I said to yesterday. I'm living by the moment. Live in the moment. That's not individuation. No, that's just egocentrism. Not necessarily egoism. They can still be very generous and very open to other things and people, but it is my ego. That's the important thing. What do I get out of it? I remember especially that do your own thing.
Right.
Or a student in class, and I wanted to talk about Rollo May. We were talking about existentialism. And so I said, Rollo May. And the student say, oh, it's Rollo May. I don't care about Rollo May, but I think, and then I had to say, I'm sorry, sir, but right now we are in this class to learn about existentialism, not about what you think. You're welcome to what you think, but not for this course. We're talking about what existentialists have brought up, like Rollo May and other people. But his big thing was, I don't care what they think, it's what I think. Do your own thing, type of thing.
Right.
That's not what individuation means,
No.
but it has been misunderstood too much, too often.
Okay, well, this has been great, and I think we kind of came full circle, didn't we? Don't you feel like we, with Boersma, we started with the minister, Boersma, is that his name?
Boomsma.
Boomsma.
He could boom on the
Boomsma.
lectern there.
Yeah, yeah.
And he was good. He was such a good man.
Yeah.
He meant so well.
Well, you know, when you were talking about that, I kept thinking about you know, I really studied Hinduism, and because of my teacher comes from that culture, they have a phrase called Maya, which is
Yeah.
everything is an illusion.
Yeah.
And how similar that is to what the Christian perspective is too. The world is not, you know, you can't trust it. It's trying to trick you. The devil's in every corner, and that they how similar. And I wonder, is there an archetype there or some sort of central Jungian idea of that of our relationship to the world that way as not being as being an illusion, you know, and as not being concrete but a trickster. I know there's a trickster archetype.
Oh yeah.
But what about that idea of the world being illusionary?
Well, that word illusionary can be mistaken too.
Uh-huh.
The Hindus also do not really mean to say, oh, there's not really that fan there.
Mm-hmm.
But what they mean is that what we think that fan really is, that's an illusion.
Mm.
We think we know. That's an illusion. That's not real. But there is something there, all right.
Okay.
It's not an illusion in the sense of you're just imagining things. No, there is something really there. But what we perceive, what we think it is, what we take it to really be, that is an illusion of ours.
Like it's my fan, or you know, somebody gave that to me.
Yeah.
Those are, I think I understand.
Because that we can also look at now that we have our knowledge in an entirely different perspective. We can look at that fan, or at yourself for that matter, as just mostly empty space being shot through by billions and billions of little subatomic particles that come into existence and disappear, come into existence, disappear, and fly around with the speed of light almost, and so on. That is much more real than that you think this is a table, or that you are a human being. That's not real. It's those particles that are real. They last much longer,
Right.
for one thing.
So how does that compare to the Christian view of the world as evil? That's a little different, isn't it?
That is different.
Yeah.
And I've never quite been able
Does
to
it have the same
stomach
kind
that.
of root, though, in terms of trying to explain something we don't understand?
Well, it's on the one hand, God is everything, right? On the other hand, God is obviously not everything.
Right.
Because, well, for one thing, he could sit down and have a sort of joke with the devil and say, well, you can do whatever you want to my man there,
Right.
Job, and Job is going to be all right. Well, where did that devil suddenly came from?
Right.
And I must confess, I've always wondered, even as a younger teenager, where did that serpent came from? Who put that serpent in the garden
Right.
that he could create all that trouble?
Yeah.
Was that not God himself? Well, and then you read the Old Testament and you see that in Isaiah, for instance, it says very clearly, God says, I am the source of all good and evil. No, that is usually not read in Christian Reformed churches, is it? I've never heard that read.
Yeah.
They avoid that even more than the Song of Solomon, because that already, as I heard one Christian Reformed, oh, such a proper lady say, that should not have been in the Bible. Those men that put it in there made a mistake. And she meant it. She was serious about that.
Right.
The Song of Solomon should not be in the Bible.
Right. Yeah.
Well, there it is. And what do they do then in the Christian churches often? Or used to, at least. Well, that's metaphoric. It doesn't really talk about the bosom of the loved one.
Her breasts were like
But
towers.
that is God loving his people.
Right.
Oh, yeah, well. No, and Christianity, too, has always been sort of double-faced on that, because on the one hand, God is all good and all omniscient and all powerful and it's the only God around. And then in the next moment they start talking about Satan and the devil, and you should not go into meditation because that opens your mind for all kinds of little demons. I've been told that by
Really?
students at Grand Valley
Ah,
when I tried to explain to them what meditation could be, and I gave them an exercise, and they said, "I'm not going to do that."
oh,
Oh no, my minister has warned me against that Eastern religion stuff.
wow.
I said, this got nothing to do with Eastern religion. They said, well, they use it too. Right. But so did Christian saints. They went into meditation and so on. Jesus went into meditation. Why do you think he went into the desert and then started talking with the devil? Yeah, but that was, we don't do that. No. So I've never been able to fully stomach, even when I did, in part, the Christian fundamentalist
Yeah.
type of thinking.
Barbara
about
ran
this.
into that quite a bit in her classes.
Oh yeah, it was, well, after all, this is Western Michigan, and then around Grand Rapids.
Yeah, and
Is all those Dutchmen still around here?
Yeah. Okay, Roel, well, let's stop for now.
Okay, well,
Yeah.
thank you, and can we leave it at this then for a while? It's been
Yes.
5 times.
5 times.
And,
It's been wonderful. And we'll check in. I'd like to be able to come and visit with you sometime.
I hope it is a little bit like what you had in mind.
It is.
Oh, okay,
Yeah.
good,
Okay, thank you.
good then. Yeah.